Hi there, I'm Des.
And I'm Tim, and together Des and I head up the men's ministry Momentum Australia.
Momentum has multiple functions, but primarily our aim is to help men to succeed in life, to do life better.
We run a weekly radio show that goes all around Australia where we talk about anything and everything that relates to men.
And we encourage men to do life in community, to do life with other men where we can be accountable, we can be welcome, we can be open and honest about what's happening in our world.
We'd love you to have a look around our website. That's momentumaustralia.org. There you'll find a bunch of resources to help you on your journey and all of our previous episodes and topics.
We thank you for your interest in Momentum Australia, and we hope you enjoyed this video today.
All right, it is Momentum. It's Tim and Des with you once again. And, every week we're just so excited to be with you all around the nation, which is terrific. And thank you again to the stations taking the show each week. MomentumAustralia.org is the website. Really encourage you to have a look around that after the show. Get familiar with who we are, what we're about. And also check out the podcast too. There's a lot of stuff in there that hopefully will help you succeed in life, which is the Momentum tagline. Des, are you good this week?
I am amazing this week.
Amazing.
I'm really good. And thanks, Tim. I mean, you're the co-host, and I love what you do, and I just acknowledge that the wonderful skills you have, and it's great. But can I just remind the guys that we do have a support line for Momentum, and it's the Momentum CARELINE, which is 1-800-000-MEN. And we're so blessed to have that number. The service is provided by our friends at CARELINE Connections, and you can reach out to them 7 days a week, 9 a.m. to 11 p.m., 1-800-000-636 or 1-800-000-MEN.
Yeah. And the truth is we all need to have a chat, a confidential chat, an honest chat at some stage in our lives. And sometimes that may not be with a mate because it might be too sensitive an issue. Yeah. You might want to remain confidential. And that's for moments, the Momentum Care Line exists. That's 1-800-000-636. And can we just say before we launch into this week's show is one of those moments. This week's show is probably going to be a little sensitive in nature, and we're going to talk about some stuff which, might have some triggers in it, depending on what your background is. So we just want to preface and say, just give you a heads up. This is an interesting topic that we're delving into. We want to acknowledge that up front because it is a sensitive topic. We're going to go back to some research to start us off in 2016, and there were around 5.7 million children in Australia. Difficult to know for sure, but estimates are that roughly 8% of boys and 20% of girls in Australia are sexually abused each year.
Yeah, and if you put those numbers together, you could fill the MCG 8 times over with children living in Australia right now who have been or will be sexually abused. Isn't that a horrific image to have in your mind? You can imagine, the cricket's been on, it's been on the MCG, and if you fill that MCG 8 times, that's the number of children living in Australia right now who have been or will be sexually abused. And sadly and alarmingly, of all those instances of abuse, 90% to 95% will be committed by who? By men. And we have to be open and honest and say that is the case. It's not good either way, but that's not a good statistic.
So we're going to delve into this topic in the next half hour or so and explore some of the effects of this. We're joined back on Momentum by a good friend, counsellor and pastor Steve Wickham. And just for some context before we launch in, Steve has served as a moderator on a global survivors and advocates Facebook group called Safe Harbor. He, since the Me Too and Church Too movements began, has developed friendships with many advocates against abuse all around the world and is considered by survivors and advocates as being trauma-informed. So, Steve, we are looking forward to hearing your insights on this incredibly sensitive topic. Welcome back to Momentum, mate.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Des. And you'd think of those 8 MCGs, and it is horrific. It really is very, very sad.
When we break down that figure further, Steve, from the intro, granted it is a few years ago, but roughly then how many young boys are being abused each year in Australia? Are there some recent stats on that?
I'm not aware of any recent stats, but I just think that the issue is so alarming, and historically, it's not just present tense. We're starting to learn now about the abuse that took place 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, because traditionally what happens is shame buries this in men's lives, or men's and women's lives, and they can't escape from it. They're driven to other means to cope. Yes. And 20, 30, 40 years later, the story might come out at such a time as this, when we are able, through this Me Too, Church Too kind of era, to come out and bring these things to the fore.
Yeah, and it devastates lives. I mean, I can't even imagine a young boy, who's innocent, being abused emotionally, physically, in every way, just destroys.
Yeah.
That's so awful, awful, awful.
Can I ask, just before we kick this off, when we come to some of our guests and we ask for topics and suggestions and things like this, is something you brought to the table, and there may not be an answer to this, but can I ask, is there a reason why at the beginning of 2023 you think that we need to be talking about this? Is it that things have progressively gotten worse to a point where we need to start talking about this, or is it the fact that the Me Too and the Church Too movements in the last few years have kind of brought this to a head and highlighted this?
Yeah, very much the latter. I think we are in an era now where we are able to bring these things to authorities. We're able to discuss these things. There's less shame, there's less stigma. And I'm not sure if the issue's any worse now than what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I would imagine it's probably fairly ambient. But the issue is it's there at all times. And you think of 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. It's an issue that, and you think of sexual abuse, it harms the individual to their core, but in so many different ways. There's so much other abuse that's done within the sexual abuse that devastates their lives.
As mentioned in the intro, a lot of this abuse, and it's a sad statistic to quote, but as Des said, 90 to 95% of it will be committed by men, right? Why do you think that is predominantly?
Well, a lot of the time it might be because men want to feel powerful. So there's that one aspect, but probably a lot of it can be, and you've got to be careful on how you say this, but a lot of it can be about men who were abused themselves and they carry that on. So there's 2 ways that sexual abuse to boys and to young men might play out in a person's life. The first road is to it repeats itself in the next generation. The other road is that it destroys the person's life. They take it within themselves, and addiction and mental health issues and those sorts of things drive the person into a destructive patterns of living, because we are designed to need to face our demons. We all need to do that.
Yeah.
Even people who haven't been sexually abused, but those who have been sexually abused, most of all, need healing. They need care. And they need the patience of kind of that trauma-informed kind of therapy, or the help, the relationships that will help them to redeem their lives.
Because it totally affects their identity. It affects their self-esteem, who they are, what they should be proud of in their world. It affects all of those core things that make us who we are.
And in many ways, they're probably, in some ways, that's a bit of a tip of the iceberg, because when you start to tip into personality disorders and those sorts of things, PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, those kinds of things, they happen directly out of the trauma of sexual abuse.
Steve, we're going to look at other forms of abuse, because there are others than just sexual. But let's just stick with sexual at the moment. You said that this is the one that hits at the core. Without sort of labeling the top 5, which is the worst and whatever, but what is it about sexual abuse particularly that is so damaging over other types of abuse, do you think?
Well, it's just so intimate. I think there's something about our genitalia. There's so much shame and so much, it levels deeper than other things. I think, and particularly if we were to look at men being abused by men, or being sexually abused by adult women. There's a corrosive disempowering of a boy in that is just horrendous. But a man abusing a boy, there's the whole gay thing, and this is not anything about gay and lesbian people, but there's an inherent issue in all of us men, and a lot of people who come out as gay will go through this, is the shame that's involved in being, having had sex with another man. Well, the fact is, you didn't have a choice. The sexual abuse happened to you. You were a victim of this. You were completely completely just disempowered.
Do you think it's different depending on who the perpetrator is? You know, a father or a mother, you know, that's a level, but then you have, you know, ministers or priests or whatever, people
Yep.
of authority,
Yep.
you know, people who are babysitting or whatever, however that looks, right?
Mhm.
Can you talk about that? Is there a scale there somewhere?
I'm not sure if there's a scale there, but I think that one thing that we can talk about is that the fact that a lot of the abuse hasn't happened by strangers. It's happened
Yeah.
through people we know, the uncle or the
Yes.
aunt, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
You know, and people with, I mean, adults have power over children, so that's one level of power. Then, if you talk about ministers or people in other situations of authority, there's an extra level of power that people
Yes.
have. And children are very, very vulnerable because they just don't have the power. And you look back in the decades gone by, children were not believed. In this day and age, at least there's a chance, there's a hope that a child might be believed. But will they have the courage to share that with it? Do they have someone safe to share that with?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the word abuse, right? Because I suppose it's good to get a clear definition of what that may look like, right? And now we've been talking about sexual abuse primarily up until now, but let's just look at the word abuse. What is the line that means someone's poor behavior? I'm talking about outside of sexual abuse here, but you know, when we say like, oh, I'm in an abusive relationship, and it's not necessarily domestic, it might be verbal or something like that. What's the line then that crosses over from someone's just had some poor behavior or poor moments, or they've, you know, lost it in a moment and just gone ballistic for 5 minutes? What's the line then that trickles over and goes, no, actually, that is not just poor behavior anymore. That is now you are in abuse.
Yeah. Well, there are probably two things as far as repeatability, you know, and particularly in bullying, you know, you need to have evidence of a repeatability. It's an ongoing pattern involved, and also the consequences. What does it actually do? What does it do to you? What are the actions themselves, and how consequential are they? But the other thing is, if we went to a legal definition, and this is from South Australia, and it says that and I preface it by saying depends on the state. But one definition is an act of abuse is defined as an act resulting in physical injury, emotional or psychological harm, and unreasonable and non-consensual, that's an important aspect, non-consensual denial of financial, social, or personal autonomy, damage to property in the ownership or possession of a person is or used or otherwise enjoyed by that person. So there's a whole bunch of elements in all of that. But I think ultimately abuse will be there'll be a pattern behind it, a repeatability, and there'll be consequences so that you can't overlook.
Okay. And now that we've got that term then, Steve, and that sort of that paragraph, if you like, to go, okay, this is what it looks like. Give us then the different types of abuse, because I mean, obviously we've talked about sexual abuse, there's domestic abuse, but then tell us about the other types of abuse that can happen to us.
Yep. So you've got obviously physical abuse when someone hurts you physically, you know, and you know, beating up and that sort of thing. There's emotional abuse, and that can be kind of, you know, we talk about gaslighting. There's a bit of emotional abuse in gaslighting. There's verbal abuse, which is very, you know, it's you feel verbally abused, insulted, and that sort of thing, or called names, belittled. Social abuse, so you might not be allowed out. You know, you might not be able to have your social needs met, and that's an abuse. Financial abuse is a big one these days. It's probably always been a big one, but holding the purse strings and controlling money and not allowing a partner perhaps not to have access to the resources they need. Spiritual abuse, which can be very big in places like churches, in Christian contexts and in other religious contexts. Neglect is a pattern of abuse in its own. There's institutional abuse, and there are institutional responses to abuse that are abusive. So there was a whole Royal Commission on that 5 years ago. And then finally, and this is not exhaustive, but finally there's elder abuse as well. Elder abuse is a huge one these days. You know, and it's so sad to see people who are vulnerable on the other side of the spectrum, not children, but people who are elderly and they're abused by younger people.
Yes.
Or in those situations.
Well, there's a lot there, and to be honest, Steve, some of those I would not have even thought of. So
Mm.
I'm glad that you brought those to our attention. You know, Steve, the obvious things, and it seems to be that there's fairly few common patterns as a result of abuse that can happen from childhood. It's, you know, trauma, addictions, you know, poor behaviors, mental health issues, split personality. I mean, these are fairly big things and responses that people can have. Let's just quickly run through some of those and how they may be present in people's lives so that we can actually recognize them, or of course, even recognize them in our own.
Yep, 100%. We talked about the trauma responses, the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. I think particularly the freeze response, when if people find themselves in a, you know, they freeze in certain situations, that can be a sign in yourself that there's that kind of trauma in you. What looking for that, I guess, is the thing. I think it's a very healthy thing for all of us to be engaged in those four, by the way, just to understand where fight, flight, freeze, and fawn work. You know, obviously, you know, this dissociation, how do we dissociate? We get into addictive behaviors because the truth is too hard. The truth is too painful. So I'll go into an addictive behaviors or get addicted to drugs, alcohol, gambling, pornography, or whatever it is that don't help the situation. But the fact is, that's a symptom of what the underlying cause was, not your fault. So, you know, if you're able to, you know, wrestle with that addiction and deal with the core, that's the key.
Steve,
Obviously,
can I jump in on that just for a tick and just again bring clarity, right? Because obviously the extreme of that is drug abuse, alcohol, gambling, those sorts of things that are fairly out there.
Yep.
What about the more subtle addictive behaviors that people might engage in that would be a distraction for them, but they're not necessarily super destructive, but they're still in their lives at a low-key level?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people who function very well at horrendous levels of addiction, but as you say, those more subtle types. I think if we're all honest, we've got some, you know, there's habits that we would have that we would like to get rid of.
Like, I mean, you're talking like things like food, pornography,
Yeah,
you know, chilling out on Netflix, like, you
yeah.
know, zoning out, you know, distracted by the phone. I mean, are these destructive, addictive behaviors?
I'm so thankful for that. Just the fact of food and Netflix. I mean, I hadn't even thought of those, but they are hugely destructive because they block us from the goals that God's got for our lives. How many hours can we waste binging on TV? It's fine to binge a little bit or watch a little bit of it if you need some rest and recovery. But the other thing is food, and I know I've used food as therapy, but you know, I've come to the decision many years ago that food is not sport. You know, food has a function in our lives, you know, to nourish our bodies. So it's about getting back to the balance of what, you know, God intended in the first place.
So if you were, you had a partner, what sort of traits would you be looking for in your partner that would lead you to think that maybe your partner or your friend or whoever has been abused?
Well, some of those trauma responses, as I mentioned before, if someone flies off the handle very quickly, you've got those addictive traits. But also, if an adult struggles to regulate their emotions, that's usually a pretty, you know, there's perhaps issues there. Impulsivity, you know, if there are mental health issues, and not everybody that gets depressed or has anxiety disorders and that sort of thing has trauma, you know, abuse in their background, but that could be part of it. And the other thing about, say, dissociative identity disorder is, you know, it's not the stereotypical multiple personalities where people chuck off one personality and, you know, it's almost like they dress differently and that's something. Most of it is about it's a much more subtle than that.
Yeah.
And there's much more of it in society than we probably recognize.
And maybe things like avoiding certain conversations or not engaging in like in a family setting, you know, not wanting to talk about things in particular.
Yep.
Yeah.
And particularly those who don't perpetrate abuse, it's the others who shrink back, who submit, who escape from life and don't receive from life all of life's blessings, simply because it's about facing those demons in a safe way and actually healing and recovering.
Yeah.
Steve, let's go back a track, and this is to the big responses that we may have to abuse. And one of the things I want to come back to is mental health issues, particularly because, I mean, obviously, you know, we hear about it all the time. We're in a mental health crisis, and, you know, everybody to some degree has some degree of mental health issue and whatever. But when we look at that realistically, if we are somebody who's had abuse in our past, what generally would that mental health tend to look like then moving forward as we grow into an adult?
Well, it's probably a complete lack of. I know victims who have never experienced joy. They've had continual anxiety. There are themes of depression and panic attack. There is triggering those kinds of things, and the mental health journey is an ongoing battle, and that's probably to answer it in that way. But then there's a diagnosable mental health battle where people who have suffered the worst abuse will have disorder upon disorder upon disorder, and those disorders are not on them. Those disorders have been perpetrated by that abuse that happened to them. So if you have got post-traumatic stress disorder, DID, the dissociative identity disorder, you've got anxiety disorder, depressive disorders. There are people who have got a whole bunch of these, and it's just so unfair and so sad.
So you had, let's for example say, you know, somebody's a man listening and he has gone through that whole experience of abuse of whatever type. How does he start to deal with that? Let's say it was me, and all of a sudden I wanted to identify it or bring it into the open, or, you know, what steps would I take? What would I have to do?
That's a really, really hard question to answer. In many ways, you cannot do it without support, and the
Yes.
support of therapy, of good friends, and it's probably a multiplicity of support,
Yeah.
pastors and others, people who are supportive. Um, Understanding from the get-go that it's going to take a lot of courage. It
Yeah.
takes a massive amount of courage for people to press into this incredibly deep and painful stuff. You know, trauma-informed therapy is about stepping through the process of therapy very, very gently and at the client's pace. It's at the person who's been a victim of this kind of abuse. It can take a very long time to overcome, but to press into it, because the more honest, the more we can face what's happened. It's not your fault. It's not our faults when we are as vulnerable children and abused in these situations.
And that's such a key message, isn't it? That men need to understand that it's not their fault.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
not to blame. You know,
yeah.
what's happened to you is because of somebody else's weakness or whatever, and that you are a God-made person in your own right.
Steve, bouncing off the back of that, I suppose if you want to say that's a stigma, you know, particularly for young boys, men who are survivors of abuse. What other stigmas do you think that men carry, particularly around having abuse in their backstory, whether it's sexual or otherwise, but particularly for a man, you know, as an adult, what does that do to him that he may carry with him as a result of that abuse?
Well, I just think it's just carried. Stigmas are such a broad kind of topic and so individualized. But I think when you compare, you're probably always comparing yourself with the person who's not been abused, and you cannot share it with others. You feel like you're closed off to it, and that nobody will accept it.
Yes,
Um,
that's
you
good.
know, and it's stigmatization is really just inherent in the whole situation. And mind you, and all of this discussion, what I'm sort of feeling right now in this moment is such a massive topic, and it feels like you don't do it any service by even talking about it in this way. But that's the nature of the issue, and that men who have been victims of this, you are believed, you are loved, and you can recover. So yeah, I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer that as well as I would like to have, Tim. But
Well, let me pitch something else at you, Steve. It seems to me that shame for men
huge.
is a
Yep.
big thing, right?
Yep.
I'm not necessarily talking about abuse even, but just guys generically, we feel shame around a lot of things. I think it's fair to say then that one of the key issues that we would need to address first and foremost is the shame that we feel around some of this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, even, if you've never had any abuse in your backstory at all, shame is still an issue. Shame and guilt are always issues for any human being.
Yes.
But you can imagine how many levels below that, how big an issue shame is for those who have been abused, and particularly sexual abuse. That erodes at a person at their core before they've even had a chance to develop. If you're under 10 or you're under 15 or your development is stunted, and it's not your fault. And so shame is a massive one.
Yeah, and I guess that leads to a conversation that says you've got to be easy on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Can't beat yourself up. You've got to
And
find a way
yeah,
of just doing life.
and the irony of that, Des, in many ways, is people will find it impossible to be easy on themselves. There will be so much self-condemnation and self-judgment. That's why the Christian message is so important for these for people healing, because there is no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. Christ knows he was there. We are loved.
Steve, as we finish up, we've covered a lot of ground, and a lot of it is given guys particularly listening things to think about. But let's speak to the wives and the partners for a tick as well as we wrap up. And they might be in a relationship and they can just sense that something's not quite right. Now, he's maybe never come out and said something.
Yep.
But there are perhaps some things that we've mentioned in this conversation, or there's just some things that just don't seem quite right. Some of the dots aren't joining.
Yep.
Let's leave the show and go speak to those people for a moment. How do they even start that conversation? How do they even broach the fact that there may be some suspicions that something isn't quite right, or something's happened in the youth of their partner?
Yep. Before I answer that, just a shout out to Dave Pittman, who has helped in the preparation of this show and has informed us. And I'm thinking of Dave and his wife, how they would have negotiated that the years and years ago that he actually wrestled with his. I think the issue is be committed. If you're a partner, be committed to the long haul. It might be asking the question, and you might get an explosive response. It might be a denial response, but keep pressing into it if you feel that there could be something. Remember the "Are you okay?" If when you ask the question, "Are you okay?" If you're asking it for the real reason, you be prepared to ask it again and again if you feel like it, and try and create situations where a person can divulge, they can disclose. And if a husband were to disclose to a wife, in those situations, just understand that it will take years, but it's a necessary process for him to become all that God wants him to become. That's the journey to invest in. And I just thank the wives right now, just listening, just thinking of those who have been through this journey, but those who are embarking on this journey with their husbands, who these beautiful, beautiful men who were disrupted as boys.
Steve, I'm going to get you to read. There was a final piece that David wrote, and we just want to honor David as we do this, because David did contribute to some of the prep to the show, and there was a piece that he wrote that I think would be really helpful to leave with.
Yeah, thank you.
In this week's show. So, Steve, would you like to read that out for us?
I'll just read it out. And this is from David Pittman's article, to suffer in silence. And this is from Grace, which is Godly Responses to Abuse in the Christian Environment. That's an organization on the web. So what can we do to help little boys and adult male survivors? On this, there isn't much variation between boys and girls who have been victimized. And this is the advice that he gives. Love them unconditionally, without judgment, and help them experience this love. Help them to know that their feelings, their confusion, anger, depression, fear, numbness, and their anxiety are normal. Help them understand that it was not their fault, that they are not to blame, that their physical reaction to whomever harmed them doesn't mean that they allowed the abuse or wanted it to happen. Invite and encourage healthy, open and shame-free conversations about sexuality, masculinity, and gender. And beyond everything else, let them know that they are not alone. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Wow.
That's really solid advice.
Yeah. Thank you for reading that out, Steve. Thank you, Dave, for writing that for us. And as we bring this week's show to a close, just acknowledge again that it's been a topic that, to be honest, we felt a little out of our depth broaching, but we wanted to do this some degree of justice and highlight this and say, hey, this is another part of life, sadly. How do we honor this, and how do we do this respectfully, and hopefully give you some keys and some steps forward to be able to move forward well, which of course is our heart at Momentum. Steve, on behalf of Des and I, thank you for speaking into this space with respect, with sensitivity. And again, guys, just want to encourage you to go back and have a listen to this once it's up on the website, momentumaustralia.org, and go easy on yourself, I think, is the key message from today. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with Momentum again. In the meantime, love you to have a look around the website, momentumaustralia.org. Until next week, you take care. God bless.
Thank you for watching this week's show, and we hope you subscribe to Momentum so you can find out what's happening in the shows in the future.
Absolutely. And keep an eye on our website too. That's momentumaustralia.org. There you'll find all of our shows and a whole heap of resources to help you on your journey. That is momentumaustralia.org.
Until next time, keep moving forward
with Momentum.